So this is the last installment of the TV stand build, and the first thing I started to do for this was make the base. It was the last big thing to build on this. So this is that walnut I had planed down in a previous video. It's a little less than 2 inches thick, and I ripped it to about 2.5 inches. You wanted something really bulky to hold up this credenza, so with those widths, that 2 inches, it's more like 1.75 inches by 2.5 inches, you'll have a nice thick stretcher so that over time this cabinet can't bow. Then once I had these pieces ripped down, I cut 3 because the third one will become the legs. I kind of tested out some angles on the top side of my cabinet. I went with 3 different ones. I believe it was 15, 20, and then maybe 30 degrees, and I ended up settling, I believe, with 15, but the process will be the same no matter what angle you settle with. And then I cut this piece. This cabinet couldn't be more than 18 inches tall, so I went with that measurement to cut my rough piece. I think those little blocks ended up being about 6 inches. And then I'm a visual builder, so I ended up mounting it on the bottom just to make sure that angle is the one I liked. So once I had my angle, I set my digital bevel gauge for it, and then I didn't change it. I used this angle for pretty much all of my cuts. So in my shop, the easiest and probably more important, the most accurate way to make all these cuts was going to be on my cross-cutting sled. I built this sled when I first started making stuff, so it's actually in need of an update, and these little miter gauges that can attach to the top of the table was a design I found online, and I've actually never used them until this build, but they ended up being invaluable. So they're just planks of wood that you can attach to those slots in the top of my miter gauge, and then they also have grooves in them so you could attach clamps, and I set that miter gauge on the table saw to the degree I needed, and then I was able to make all of my cuts. So I cut that 15 degrees on the edge of both of my legs. Now this would be easier with longer stock, but in order to test it out on the piece, I did cut them down, and then the last 2 legs I needed, you could see I'm cutting out of that extra piece I cut. And it's the same thing, you could just slide them down and cut them all. Once you have that angle set, they'll all be identical. So then once they were in place, I marked them, and the marks are going on the long stretchers so I could cut the exact same angle on those, kept everything in place, cut that edge angle, and then I could flip it around and cut it on the other side. Same thing for the second piece, because there's 4 legs and 2 stretchers. And then once I had all my pieces, I could test to make sure those angles lined up and everything looks good. Now to attach these, I'm going to be using lap joints. So this is screwing a stop into the edge of that crosscut sled, so I'm always going the same depth, and then I raise my blade to cut halfway through the piece, and then just slid it along, making a bunch of curves, and then I could clean out the excess. And like I said, the nice part about this setup is with that miter gauge set at the right degree in the back, everything's always cut identical. There's many ways you could cut these, but like I said, this was the easiest and most accurate for my shop. So once I had that first cut, I could go make my marks on my legs and then make the identical depth cut. This was a little more dangerous because they are such short pieces, which is why being able to clamp everything in place was really convenient. And the most important cut is that first cut, because that's what's setting your angle. These other ones really, you could see it moving around a little bit, and that didn't end up mattering because you're just removing all of that anyway. And then once I had those all cleaned up, I could test it onto my piece, make sure everything works, and then I could cut the pieces for the other parts. So this was the only time I had to move that jig. I had to move it to the other side. Unlike when you're cutting the legs, when you could just flip the piece, the laps have to be on opposite ends. So I had to move everything over, but with my bevel gauge set, it was easy to reset up that miter. I did do a test piece you could see here, making sure I set everything up properly, but once I had that degree on the opposite side of my sled, it was a rinse and repeat sort of process. I lined it back up with my mark, set that stop, and then cut all of my laps. Now this long stretcher ended up hitting part of my wall, so you'll see me, I won't cut to the end of it, and then I just clean it up on the other side of the table saw quickly in order to get those curves. I kind of went back and forth with the best way to attach these stretchers to the legs. Originally I was thinking mortise and tenons were the way I wanted to go, because I feel like for woodworkers that's kind of well known as being one of the sturdiest joints to make. However, I was watching a bunch of videos of people testing joints, and across the board on multiple YouTube videos and Fine Woodworking and a couple magazines, the lap joint was by far the strongest of all the joints, and the conclusion to that was because there's so much surface area that gets glue. So that's what I went with this piece, and it seems like that's what other people use for these sorts of joints as well. So once I had all of my pieces, this is where the new workbench comes in handy. I could really, with a sharp chisel, clean up all those laps to remove all those kerf marks, make a nice smooth surface, and that would be almost ready for glue. So this is the track that's on the bottom of the cabinet, and I ended up staining it, and it will look like it sticks out like a sore thumb now, but once you put the clear coat on this cabinet, it's about the same shade as that stain, and it will just make everything match much better than having left it that kind of stark interior plywood color. Then for the backer, I just cut it down based on that opening in the back. This is 1/2 inch birch veneer ply, and it's going to fit nicely in between all those rabbets, and eventually I will stick a couple screws in this to hold everything in place, but it fits in that cabinet pretty snugly. You arguably don't even need screws. And then, like I said, I believe in an earlier video, instead of veneering this back part, I decided to paint it black, so that's just painting the whole piece and that back there black. So the next up came making the knobs for the doors, and they are matching hardware that's on the drawers, which you won't see till the end. So I kind of roughed out a shape, and then I transferred the width and the depth of that shape into a 1/2 inch piece of plywood, and then I cut out that shape on my table saw using thin curves. Once I had that, this is the bit I'm using with that top side bearing to follow that pattern, and then I'll cut out this rectangle on the top side of my drawers, and then I could fill that recess with the shape pull I want. So I'm making multiple passes on this to avoid tear out, because that would be pretty catastrophic at this point in the process. And router work's always hard to film because your body just completely gets in the way, but you can kind of see how I'm slowly going down the depth. Then I'm taking a piece of scrap and I'm cutting it. I think that groove ended up being about a 1/2 inch. And then this is a 1/2 inch hole saw, so I'm going to cut a circle not all the way through this piece, about 3/4 of the way through this piece. And then the one downside of a router is it leaves rounded corners, so then I just sharpened up those corners with a sharp chisel, made a nice square piece, and then I'll take that walnut plug I have with the circle in it, and I will make measurements on it and then cut that out on the table saw. So you can't really see it in the video, especially on walnut, but I have marks for the width and the depth of those grooves, because they're the same on both pieces with that template, and then I'll rip it in half, and those will be essentially my 2 plugs. So I cut these on the other side of my mark so I could get a nice tight fit in these doors. And this is actually, sometimes I accidentally misbuy sandpaper, and this is adhesive back sandpaper, but it comes in handy for stuff like this because I could just attach it to my template and clean up those edges and get a nice tight fit in those doors. So once those were in place, I could chisel out that plug, and the nice thing about having the hole saw is it leaves a nice perfect mark for you, so I could chisel all that excess out and then have my pulls. Now if you have a keen eye, you'll probably notice later on the video these poles change size, and the customers had come through to check out the cabinet, and the poles, they wanted a little bit bigger and a little bit deeper, and it was definitely the right decision. They ended up working a little bit nicer than these. Your finger, they were slightly shallow for pulling open a drawer, but I'm not going to show changing the size because the process is the same. Then once those were done, I was able to glue all this together. So I glued the legs to the stretchers first and let those set up overnight with some C-clamps on all of those joints. And then this is the part of the video where I'm kind of doing finishing work after these get glued together. So stuff I've been putting off during the whole process, and this was one of them, edge banding that back edge. So to make the veneer go longer, I actually ripped it in half and then edge banded that back edge of the cabinet. Then once the legs were glued together, I cut a slight inner taper on the legs to just make them look a little sleeker. So it was a rough cut on my bandsaw, and then I ended up cleaning it up with chisels and a sander, making sure the doors fit and the poles work. And then this is installing the hardware for the drawers, and you'll see why the door poles are the shape they are. So this was a pretty simple process. I just measured where my marks are and then pre-drilled some holes and attached all that. So in order to attach my two legs together, I'm going to be putting some dados in my stretchers and attaching them with some walnut slats. So this is taking some of that walnut and ripping it down to size. I think those ended up being 3/4 inch thick. And then to cut on my dados, I just made incremental marks on them. I think I ended up with 5 or 6 dados, and you could see I have a shim on my fence, so I could set it up on each side and cut those dados identical. And the middle dado, I just kind of eyed up on the stack, and then because my fence doesn't go as far, I just marked it on there and then transferred those marks and then cut that one as well. And then trimmed all of those cross members to size, and then dry fit everything together, and then glued everything up, and then I let this set up overnight as well. And the next day I just sanded off all that glue, and between the planer and the table saw, this walnut's left pretty smooth. There wasn't a ton of sanding to do, but the bandsaw left a fairly rough cut on those table legs, so I put 120 grit in the belt sander and really cleaned up that inner taper nicely. And then this was the first time putting the cabinet on top of the legs and seeing how it looks. Adding all the pieces. And then in order to attach these legs, so the legs are 2.5 inches thick. So in order to use 2.5 inch screws, I just kind of countersunk with a spade bit 1/2 inch down, and then pre-drilled all those holes. The holes are a little bit bigger than my screws. With plywood and these legs, you won't have to worry as much about movement as you would, say, a tabletop, but I still wanted a little bit of give in the joint there, and then I just attached them to the table with 2.5 inch screws. The backer, this is cutting a couple holes for wires and all that to go through, and that was just a matter of putting the backer by the cabinet, making sure these holes aligned with the 4 cubbies so that wires can pass out through that back side. Then this is after those poles were glued into place, and right there I'm cutting a piece of veneer. I didn't show this on film, but that back side of the pole, since you're cutting into that cabinet face, it's plywood. So in order to hide that, I just glued in a piece of veneer in there and then left these oversized so I could trim them down flush with a plane and some chisels. And these are the new size poles. You can't really tell the difference, but they are bigger. put them in place and make sure they work, and it's much easier to use them with the new size. So I'm not going to film a ton of the finishing process. I'm actually going to put a link in the description of a video that goes through the finishing process really well. I'm putting general finishes, arm and seal on this. It's a satin finish, and the video will show you a very detailed step-by-step process. But basically I went through first and went over the whole surface with mineral spirits. This is important. I've done this on all my projects with water-based pieces. You could use water. If I was staining something, I would use pre-stain, and that is just going to show any imperfections on the finish that would show up once you clear coat it. If there's gobs of glue, sometimes you miss them, it will show you that. And then I went through and I sanded from about 80 grit through 150. Once I was done with that, I did the same process with the mineral spirits to show any marks, cleaned up any marks I had, and then I applied that general finish with a rag. It's you can brush it on, but you can also just rub it on with a rag. So finishing, especially in the winter time, just takes a while. Everything takes longer to dry, but this took especially long because it's so low to the ground. In order to finish it properly, I had it flipped upside down and I refinished the bulk of the inside as well as the bottom, and let all that set up, and then flipped it back over, and now I'm finishing the sides and the top and the front edge. So this whole process ended up taking about 2 weeks, which is why these videos are so late. But I'll end up putting, the can recommends 3 coats, which is what I'm at now, but I'll probably put at least 5 on the top side of this. And then for each consecutive coat, I go through with 600 grit sandpaper, hand sand the whole surface, and then it's the same process. You put the mineral spirits on there to take all of that dust off. Since it's such a big piece, I actually usually go over it with tack cloth as well, and then recoat with the finish, and then that's going to be probably, like I said, a 5-step process, doing it 5 times. This is that cabinet. I'm probably going to put 1 or 2 more coats of finish on the tops, the doors, and the drawer fronts. The inside's pretty much done, but by the time I upload this video, this is where it will be at, which is 3 coats. You can see how everything's put together. The only thing I haven't reassembled is the drawer pulls, because like I said, I'm going to be coating that, but this is that finish. The last thing I'll probably do to this that I'm not going to film is on these grooves and on the tops and bottoms of these pulls, these doors, I'm going to be putting wax. And then the one thing you never really see in this video is the backer in place. This is the backer with the coats on there, and I am not a lover of this maple and birch veneer ply. They're kind of interchangeable, clear coated. With that arm and seal, I used to be a polyurethane person just because it's so easy to get. That arm and seal is not readily available around me, so I usually have to order it. So I end up just kind of by default using poly. But I've been using this a couple times now, and it just is such a nice, easy finish to apply, and it really makes that plywood actually look pretty nice.